What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and today it's a cup car comparison. We have 3 different cars from 3 different sims on 3 different engines, so let's see what we're going to get. We have the Automobilista Boxer Cup Car, which is not an officially licensed Porsche 911 GT3 Cup Car, but we all know what it's supposed to be. We have the Assetto Corsa 2017 Porsche 911 GT3 Cup Car, as well as the iRacing 2017 Porsche 911 GT3 Cup Car. Imola will be used for this evaluation because it's available in all 3 platforms. Assetto Corsa and iRacing obviously both have the version of Imola that is laser scanned. Automobilista's is not, however it is still pretty accurate comparing to the other 2 versions that are laser scanned. There are some slight differences from the tracks because Imola and Assetto Corsa is slightly older. There's a few areas where there's a little bit less runoff. The curbs are a little bit different here and there, but overall it should be close enough for our purposes to at least know if we're in the ballpark. As for the setup of the testing sessions, I tried to keep it in the afternoon. Unfortunately, you can't control the time of day specifically in iRacing, so it is going to differ a little bit. However, this is not a graphics comparison. That's not the point of this video. There's plenty of that already out there that I don't need to cover. However, all of these titles are running with all the graphics turned up. The field of view is the same across all 3 platforms. However, there is some slight difference in the eye point of view. That is just the eye point of view. That is not the field of view that is differing, as well as obviously the graphical modeling in the cockpits. All testing was performed with ABS turned off on all platforms, along with 15 gallons of fuel, roughly good enough for a race distance, as well as a little bit of rear wing taken out of the car, as this is Imola. Tire pressures adjusted a little bit, but nothing too crazy. I haven't spent hours tweaking the setup and making it absolutely perfect in either one of these platforms. Just the basic preliminary things that I'd be doing if I was going to be just hopping into the car and going, basically. Testing was carried out in Assetto Corsa and iRacing at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, because it's nice and easy to remember. All 3 platforms are set to a high track grip setting. In Automobilista, we're using the high grip setting. iRacing, high grip setting, extensive usage, I believe it's called something like that. Assetto Corsa, we are using the fast track grip setting. The optimum track grip setting is a bit faster, however, I don't think that really relates to reasonable real-world conditions at all, which is why I used the fast track grip setting. For those of you guys out there who just want lap time comparisons and how they stack up to the real world, conveniently enough, Porsche Carrera Cup Italia has raced at Imola in the 2016 race with a slightly slower version of the car, or what should be slightly slower. The fastest race lap in race 1, which I figured would be a reasonable point of comparison, was a 146.829. My best lap in iRacing after a couple of laps was around a 146.8 something. My lap times in Automobilista were pretty consistently a 147.2. Assetto Corsa was a little bit slower. It was actually kind of difficult for me to break into the 147s, but eventually I did and was able to run consistently 147.7s pretty much all day, every day. However, there is something I will talk about later that explains that weird oddball result. At least to me, I don't consider lap times the end-all be-all. What I really wanted to do with this comparison was not look at just lap times, although they are all 3 well within the realms of plausibility and within that ballpark where the lap time should be, but rather, we have 3 different models of the same car, more or less. Do we have one car that's in 3 different platforms, or do we have 3 different cars on 3 different engines that drive radically different? That's what I really wanted to find out. As part of this, in my driving, I wasn't looking or feeling for the force feedback in the same way that I might do when I'm normally driving. I was really focusing on just what are my inputs? What are my feet doing? What are my hands doing? You know, things like that, rather than what the car is trying to tell me through the force feedback. I'll talk about the force feedback a little bit later because I do think it's also an important part of the discussion. However, I do think a lot of people tend to get caught up in what the force feedback is telling them rather than what is actually happening. So let's start with braking because that's where the festivities begin. Automobilista, as well as Assetto Corsa, have a brake pressure setting, which I set to 95% in both cars, which does make it a little bit easier. It makes the brakes less effective. iRacing does not have this feature, as well as iRacing has seemingly modeled a crazy high, theoretically possible brake pressure setting, which means that brake lockup in iRacing occurs at roughly about 65-70% pedal travel versus being able to use the full length of the pedal. However, braking distances are basically exactly the friggin' same. So yeah, it's just one of those platform things, and it's really quite annoying, quite frankly, that you're using so little pedal travel in iRacing, but it isn't affecting the brake distances. Both iRacing and Assetto Corsa really demanded that you keep the wheel absolutely straight for threshold braking, otherwise you would very easily lock the inside front tire. Automobilista was a little bit more forgiving in this regard, however, it was still something that you had to consciously pay attention to, because otherwise, again, you would lock that inside front tire because there's not a lot of loading going on there. Both the Assetto Corsa and iRacing versions of the car felt like they were moving around a little bit on braking, iRacing a little bit more so. Automobilista here in this regard was a good bit more tame. It just felt like it was kind of just going. It had more momentum to it, and it wasn't as upset over the bumps, although there are some significant bumps in the braking zones in the Automobilista version of Imola. In terms of cornering speed across the corner, they were roughly pretty much the same and could be accounted for in any small differences in the circuits and bumps, as well as perhaps minor variances in the conditions. Comparing to a video that I found out there from a race session, again, of Porsche Carrera Cup Italia, it seems like they are definitely well within the realm of plausibility and pretty much exactly more or less the same, accounting for driver differences and things like that. It's when we're putting the power down that things start to differ a bit more, and this is really the biggest area of difference besides the braking and how the brakes work in the various platforms. Automobilista's version of this car requires you to roll into the power a bit more than the Assetto Corsa or iRacing versions of the same car. In addition to that, the car picks up significantly more understeer than either the Assetto Corsa or iRacing versions. It's one of those things where you really have to wait for the power a good bit longer than in Assetto Corsa or iRacing, because that understeer is going to hurt you. There is a reason, though, that I didn't just tweet that out, which I'll discuss here in a moment. Both iRacing and Assetto Corsa felt very similar as to what was going on and what was happening, though, in these instances. Both of them wanted to absolutely come out of the corner and just go like nobody's business, and it's quite unbelievable. Both of them could get a little bit sideways if you got a little bit too frisky with it, but was easily recovered, and you could pretty much drive through any of those minor little slides that you'd encounter. You could do the same thing in Automobilista, however, again, the car just had a little bit more understeer in those situations, which meant that you couldn't really pick up the throttle in the way you wanted to. So why didn't I dial that understeer out in Automobilista? Because curbs. Automobilista was very, very temperamental over the curbs, to the point where if you nibbled on a curb a little bit, you would get a lot of oversteer in an instant, which was really handy for getting around the corners, but at the same time, you couldn't attack the curbs in the same way that you could in Assetto Corsa and iRacing, where you can just really use and abuse those things and pound the ever-loving snot out of the thing. Assetto Corsa did have a little bit more bounce and pogo to it. iRacing felt more like Automobilista, for example, in Variante Alta, where you just kind of smash into the curbs and go. But other than that, they were very similar in the way that they handled the curbs. Very well conditioned. It could handle a little bit of abuse. Automobilista, not so much. Although that oversteer that you get is very handy for dialing out that understeer that you get coming off of the corner. Something else worth mentioning is it felt like the car in Assetto Corsa was more mid-engine rather than rear-engine. For example, coming around the sweeping downhill right-hand corner into the final double left corner. Sorry, the name escapes me right now. But in Assetto Corsa, you could easily keep the throttle pinned through that right-hander and still set up well to the right to make the left. Whereas in iRacing and Automobilista, you had to really start breathing out of the throttle with the fuel load and actually properly setting up for that corner. Looking at some onboards from the real world, it seems like the drivers were actually lifting out of the throttle a bit to set up for that. So it seems like that's definitely an area where Automobilista and iRacing are a little bit closer to the reality. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there because it doesn't necessarily feel all substantially different, but through that corner for one particular reason, it seems like that was really the biggest difference. Because honestly, otherwise throughout the circuit, looking at the lap times and everything, looking at the cornering speeds and looking at my inputs, it's not that different. It's not that different at all, and it's actually pretty impressive to see from my standpoint, because if you go back 10 years ago, 10 years plus, we went from GTR1 to GTR2, and it's like, what is this? It's like cars had radically changed, whereas now we see 3 different models done independently of one another, simulating one car, and we're starting to see a much, much stronger correlation as to what this car should be handling like, what this car should behave like, how this car should be able to go around the corner, and then you're seeing real-life evidence, from the real world, obviously, where it's correlating. Everything's looking right, and that's where we're starting to see that progress in terms of simulation. So why was the Assetto Corsa version of this car slower? It performed roughly about the same, it was just slower. Simple as that. And it comes down to a couple of different factors. First of all, I'm probably a better driver in Automobilista and iRacing than I am in Assetto Corsa. It's just a fact. I spend more time with those 2 platforms than I do with Assetto Corsa, and that's that. As well as Imola in Assetto Corsa is a slightly older version of the circuit where there's a little bit less of the green AstroTurf runoff area, as well as in Assetto Corsa that green AstroTurf runoff is much more slippery than either Automobilista or iRacing. But there's something even bigger than that, and that is fuel consumption. I went into this with the idea of putting in enough fuel to do like a 25 to 30 minute race, as well as give myself a little bit of a fudge factor, just in case the fuel consumption varies a little bit. And it did, for one sim in particular. Assetto Corsa used significantly less fuel per lap. In both iRacing and Automobilista, I was using about 4 liters of fuel per lap, whereas in Assetto Corsa, I was using about 2.5 liters of fuel per lap. Now, obviously, if you're using less fuel per lap, you need less fuel in the car to go the same distance, which means that the car is going to be lighter, which means that it's going to be faster, it's going to have more response to it, it's going to be peppier, it's going to go faster, and you're going to lose that lap time incrementally over the course of a full lap. So the car's going to speed up once you put the same amount of fuel per distance in the car. Personally, I believe both iRacing and Automobilista are much more correct in this regard, because a full tank of fuel in a car like this is generally considered to be about an hour of runtime, roughly, give or take, as opposed to Assetto Corsa, where it ends up equating out to something like an hour and a half of runtime, which is pretty ridiculous, especially at a circuit like Imola, where you're spending a lot of time at full throttle. You add that all together, and that has explained pretty sufficiently the margin of error on this test, I do feel like. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'll talk about the force feedback really quickly here, but I don't want to spend too much time to it because I think it's very simple to answer. All 3 cars did have a little bit of on-center floatiness, where the force feedback just really doesn't do anything. There's just not a lot of weight in the wheel going down the straights. iRacing and Assetto Corsa were both about the same in that regard, where there's probably about 10 degrees left and right as to where there just really wasn't a whole lot of resistance, and then it loaded up. Automobilista was roughly about half of that. I think that has much more to do with the real feel settings that Riza Studios has included for the Boxer Cup car specifically by default than anything else. Because again, all 3 systems are using the force feedback generated from the physics and what's actually happening, so there shouldn't be that substantial difference in terms of what's going on. But the real reason I don't want to spend too much time talking about force feedback, and I don't really think it's all that noteworthy, is the iRacing car felt like an iRacing car. The Assetto Corsa car felt like an Assetto Corsa car. The Automobilista car felt like an Automobilista car. I know people are going to ask this, which one do I prefer? And the answer for me is relatively simple and straightforward. iRacing and Automobilista. Now, that's not because the Assetto Corsa car is terrible or wrong, because quite clearly it's doing the same things. It's just I'm more comfortable with what iRacing and Automobilista communicate to me as the person trying to drive the car around the circuit, rather than Assetto Corsa. Someone who's an Assetto Corsa fan first and foremost would probably say the exact same things about iRacing and Automobilista, because They just find the feedback for one way or another better in that title. So while yes, it does sound like a cop-out of an answer, I know, you know, I don't think I can say anything other than that. So that's that. 3 different sims, 3 different engines, 1 car, 1 circuit, 1 guy driving it, and the output is more or less pretty similar. And yet we spend so much time arguing about physics. Hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.